From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Shots fired at Maryland Mosque shortly after a funeral. Trump announces plans to launch a new social network, Truth Social. COVID-19 vaccine boosters are immoral and unfair, says WHO chief. Regional powers back aid for Afghanistan as Russia hosts Taliban. And a special segment on drug overdose deaths in the U.S. Our top story tonight. Shots were fired yesterday at around 2 p.m. local time at the Diyanet Center of America in Lanham, Maryland. One person at the entrance of the mosque was hit multiple times and is currently hospitalized. The gunman was able to get away before police arrived. Officer Thomas Foster said his detectives do not believe this to be a random act of violence. The center is the largest of its kind in the United States. Along with the mosque, the facility has a school, residences, a restaurant, a meeting center, and even a funeral home spread out over several acres. The FBI in New York and police in Long Island's Nassau County are seeking the public's help with finding a suspect in connection with an acid attack on St. Patrick's Day. The victim, Nafia Ikram, was a Hofstra University student. The FBI said she sustained serious physical injuries and burns to her face, eyes, and arms in the attack last March. The FBI is offering up to $20,000 as a reward for information leading to an arrest. Nassau County Police previously offered a similar reward for information. A former student pleaded guilty on Wednesday to killing 17 people in a shooting rampage at a high school in Parkland, Florida in 2018. Nicholas Cruz also apologized in court to relatives of the victims. Cruz, who was 19 at the time, took a legally purchased AR-15 assault rifle into his former school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The shooting was the worst school massacre in the United States since the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School attack in Newton, Connecticut. That left 26 children and staff dead. The Florida shooting stunned the country and sparked new efforts led by students from the school itself for tougher gun control. However, U.S. Congress has yet to enact meaningful gun reform. Former U.S. President Donald Trump announced plans Wednesday to launch his own social networking platform. Called Truth Social, it is expected to begin its beta launch for invited guests next month. The long-awaited platform will be owned by Trump Media and Technology Group, or TMTG. In a statement, Trump said he created Truth Social and TMTG to stand up to the tyranny of big tech. Trump was banned from Twitter and Facebook in the wake of the Capitol insurrection, which was carried out by his supporters on January 6 this year. Since then, he has always been looking for ways to reclaim his internet platform. London Mayor Sadiq Khan says he is excited and humbled to be elected the new chair of C40. C40 Cities is a global network of almost 100 megacities committed to addressing climate change. Khan says he will work with other city leaders at COP26 to fight climate change and to address air pollution. COP26 is an upcoming climate summit in Glasgow next month, where global warming will top the agenda. Here is Mayor Sadiq Khan.
One of the things I'm hoping to do as the new chair is to work with great cities across the globe fighting the issue, climate change, because we have a climate emergency, but also addressing the twin challenge of air pollution as well. And I think we've shown the way with some world-leading policies, from the world's first ultra-low emission zone to a record number of electric buses, increasing hugely the number of charging points. And I'm hoping for a green recovery as we come out of this pandemic.
The 10-country Moscow talks on Afghanistan concluded Wednesday with the adoption of a joint statement on the country. It formalized the position and demands of member nations to the Taliban. Participants included China, India, Iran, and Pakistan. In a statement, the 10 countries vowed to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. They also said they viewed the Taliban as the new Afghan authorities, despite the absence of official recognition, and will interact with them respectfully. In addition, the group backed the idea of a United Nations donor conference to help the country stave off economic collapse and a humanitarian catastrophe. Afghanistan's economy is in peril, with international aid cut off, food prices rising, and unemployment spiking. Here is the Taliban's Deputy Prime Minister Abdus Salam Hanafi.
باید هم این حق مردم افغانستان است که باید حکومت جدید به رسمیت شناخته شود و طبعا اگر حکومت جدید به رسمیت شناخته نشود و حمایت نشود در اینجا طبعا گروه هایی که امنیت را اخلال میکنند طبعا آنها تقویت میشوند.
The increasing use of boosters for the COVID-19 vaccine is immoral, unfair, and unjust, and it has to stop. These were the words of World Health Organization Chief Tedros Ghebreyesus to CNN's Becky Anderson on Tuesday. He said that while every other continent has administered a single vaccine dose to over 50% of their populations, only 7% of Africans have received one dose. Ghebreyesus said, "We will not stop the pandemic by ignoring a whole continent, and the continent that doesn't have any manufacturing capacity of other means." While the WHO has recommended an additional vaccine dose for immunocompromised people, it strongly opposes the widespread use of booster shots until more of the world gets vaccinated with one dose. Local media reports that at least 10 Dutch municipalities have been investigating mosques and Islamic institutions through private companies. According to local daily NRC Handelsblad, mosque officials and members active in the Muslim community were investigated on behalf of municipalities using unlawful undercover methods. The agency's staff reportedly entered mosques and visited community leaders without revealing their true identities. The newspaper also found that investigative reports were written up but were not made public, nor were they shared with the municipal councils and the organizations that were investigated. Spoor, an organization representing Dutch Muslims, issued a statement calling the investigations an example of Islamophobia. It said, "With a government that so violently and radically portrays the Muslim community as the other and potentially dangerous, populism seems to have reached the upper government levels." Earlier this year, far-right politician Geert Wilders campaigned to close mosques and Islamic schools, as well as to ban the Quran in the Netherlands. His party, the Party for Freedom, also called for the establishment of a ministry for repatriation of Muslims and de-Islamification. Indonesian restaurant owner Made Nur Yasa set out to solve the problem of plastic pollution by offering rice in exchange for garbage. This led to more than 500 tons of plastic being collected by more than 200 villages on the Indonesian island of Bali. Organizers have given out more than 550 tons of rice in exchange. Yasa said he started the barter system to help cleanse the soul of nature and relieve the economic hardship of neighbors. The COVID-19 pandemic ground Bali's tourism industry to a halt. Bali derives 50% of its GDP from tourism alone. Workers in that industry had to go back to their rural villages, and plastic pollution skyrocketed. Yasa hosted the first plastic exchange at his childhood village in May 2020. The Arab Parliament on Wednesday condemned recent statements by French President Emmanuel Macron against Algeria, calling them irresponsible and unacceptable. The Parliament said in a statement that it was also surprised by the remarks, which it said deny a despicable colonial history. Last Thursday, Macron accused Algerian authorities of stoking hatred against France. He also said, "Was there an Algerian nation before French colonization? That is the question." On Saturday, Algeria issued a statement condemning the French president's remarks. The Arab Parliament said it affirmed its support for Algeria's leadership and people against every abuse that affects its identity, historical heritage, and achievements written with the blood of millions of martyrs. It also reiterated its support for Algeria's promising democratic path under the leadership of President Abdelmajid Tebboune. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
I am what hunger looks like in America.
I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch. Till September.
I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. The number of U.S. drug overdose deaths jumped nearly 30% from March 2020 to March 2021. That's according to newly released figures from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. To discuss this, let's go over to Imam Malik Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. Well, there is a whole lot of focus, rightfully, on the COVID-19 pandemic. There are people dying for other causes as well. Heart failure and heart-related problem actually were number 1 killer in 2020, and second was the pandemic. But there is another one which is almost like a pandemic, but not much in conversation as much as it need to be, and that is drug overdose. It killed 96,000 people. So with us is someone who knows the history of drug use and the pandemics, street drugs, as well as war on drugs. Well, that's the one war which is going on like other wars. Please join me to welcome Professor David Herzberg.
Hello.
Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Professor Herzberg is a professor, associate professor of history at the University of Buffalo College of Arts and Sciences. Well, first of all, give us 101 of opioid. Am I pronouncing correctly? What is it, and what is this problem?
Opioid is a class of drugs that were originally derived from the opium poppy. And they are mostly known in modern medicine as painkillers, although they have been used for thousands of years for a wide range of purposes, and they have a wide range of effects on the human body. The problem associated with them is that if a person uses them regularly for a length of time, they develop a tolerance to its effects, so its effects will get weaker over time. They develop a dependence on it so that if they stop using it, there will be very unpleasant symptoms and suffering called withdrawal. And in some people, the intense urge to keep using the drug and avoid those withdrawal symptoms can become so strong that they continue to use the drug even if it is causing significant problems for their life. And we call that state addiction, which is continued compulsive use despite harms and negative consequences.
So how big is the magnitude of opioid problem? The the death of people, is it enough a variable, or there are other statistics which can help us understand what is the size of this problem?
Well, the current problems with opioids in the United States are probably as big as they have ever been in history in terms of absolute numbers, and maybe also in terms of the number of people compared to the overall population. But there's a significant question that we need to think about involving the term that we're using, which is the problem. And I think that people have different ideas of what they are saying when they talk about the opioid problem. Some people such as me, mean harms associated with opioid use. And by harms, I mean things like fatal overdose, people dying, or other kinds of health issues that can come. For example, many people inject opioids using hypodermic syringes, and this can pass illness, for example, HIV/AIDS or hepatitis, if people are not using clean needles. So those are health problems associated with drug use. There are some people who use the word problem to mean something different. They see use of drugs itself as a problem, regardless of whether or not it is causing health harms to the person using the drug. It is possible to use opioids, even to become dependent on opioids, and not have a negative impact on your health. So one question that we need to understand in thinking about this opioid crisis is, what situations make it more or less likely that people who use opioids will suffer from the kinds of harms that we're seeing now in terms of fatal overdose?
So when did opioid actually become a crisis?
There have been two periods of time in the United States when opioids have been at crisis levels. One was in the late 19th century, which I'm happy to talk about if you want. It was quite a while ago. And the other one started, the roots are in the 1980s, and it began to grow significantly in the 1990s. This was a period of time in which regulations of industry in general were being scaled back and cut down, thanks to the success of a political coalition in the United States that saw government bureaucracy as an obstacle to solving social problems and wanted to unleash the private sector to solve problems. One of those problems was widespread problems with chronic pain. This is pain that persists over a long period of time. And the pharmaceutical industry was invited to play a larger role in grappling with chronic pain. And companies, the first one to really take advantage of this opportunity was Purdue Pharmaceuticals. And they introduced a new opioid called OxyContin. It was a very old drug. It had been around since 1923, the ingredient of oxycodone. But they put a new coating on it so that if you swallowed it, the coating would slowly dissolve over a long period of time, meaning that you would receive the drug effects slowly over time instead of all at once. And they marketed this pill as if it was had very little risk of addiction, and they wanted to dramatically expand the kinds of chronic pain that this sort of powerful opioid could be used to treat. And when they had success doing this, they persuaded physicians and regulators to accept these new uses for opioids by spending lots and lots of money and funding influential figures in medicine. Once other companies saw them succeeding with this, they began to jump in as well and helped create a new medical approach to chronic pain that featured using opioids early and using a lot of opioids with relatively little concern for addiction and other harms.
How many people are addicted to opioid at this moment in the United States?
Oh, that's a good question, and it's not one that I actually know the answer to. I suspect that that there are people who estimate that, and it's difficult. It's difficult to estimate because you can, for something like a fatal overdose, this is something you can simply count. But depending on how you define addiction and whether people are, whether authorities are aware of a person's addiction, so I can't actually answer that question. But I know that there are a lot of people who use opioids now.
I understand that. So if 90,000 plus people are dying because of the addiction, or is it other complications?
Well, that's a really good question. How and why does someone die of opioids? Because ordinarily, when you use the drug regularly for a long time, you develop a tolerance. The effects get less powerful, and thus some people may want to take more, for example. But this means that the drug is not dangerous to regular users. That someone who uses an opioid regularly could use an amount that would kill me, but it will not kill them. So the question is, in what conditions does an addiction become fatal? And what happened here is that while the medical system was handing out opioids left and right for chronic pain, people who used opioids had access to legally regulated, quality controlled drugs that they knew exactly what they were getting. It said 10 milligrams, it was 10 milligrams. When there was an attempt by authorities to restrain the pharmaceutical industry from overselling these drugs, some of these regulations focused in an area of preventing people with addiction from buying pharmaceuticals at all. So rather than just restricting the marketing hype from the pharmaceutical industry, they also said, well, if you've become addicted, you can't buy pharmaceuticals anymore. And you had a lot of people who used to buy pills that they knew what they were. Well, they were addicted. They were very strongly motivated to keep using opioids, but they couldn't buy the safe drugs anymore. So they switched to a different market, illegal markets, where they did not know what they were getting. And right now, one of the major problems going on in these markets is that they have become contaminated with an extremely powerful opioid called fentanyl. Fentanyl is so powerful that even people with addiction who have developed a high tolerance, if they can easily accidentally take too much fentanyl and overdose. And this is the danger of an illegal market where they don't know what they're buying.
So government first decided, okay, the companies will have a solution, government doesn't. And then they went heavy that you cannot buy them. I mean, I remember a friend from out of town who has no relatives, friends, or family here, was operated upon, and he was recommended some drugs. I don't know what they were. But when I went to purchase, they started investigating me, pharmacist. I have produced a whole lot of IDs and this and that, talked to physician, they still refuse to give me. And they say, you need to bring. I say, he just had his surgery. He was taken in an ambulance to his home to rest. He cannot come. So it seems that the pendulum is swinging on the other side of the pendulum. So let's talk about the war on drugs. Are there some lessons from war on drugs as we have this war now on opioid?
Yeah, there are a couple of lessons here, and I will focus on two of them, and I will try to be brief. One thing is that the pendulum is indeed swinging back to restricting opioid sales, but it's also important to remember that opioid sales were not built up for every type of patient consumer. That primarily patients who were understood as or categorized as white from their racial background, they were more likely to be prescribed opioids because physicians saw them as people who were essentially sympathetic, that their suffering needed treatment. They saw them as safe, people who were less likely to become addicted. This didn't turn out to be true, but even at the height of the opioid crisis, when they were writing prescriptions left and right, it was difficult, for example, if you were a person of color, to get opioids even in case of dire need. So it's important to remember that these laws have not always been equally applied, and the policies haven't always been equally applied. And that brings us to the second part of your question.
It means the person who refused me and wanted my friend to show up may be reacting based on some of those racial components of it?
It's entirely possible. Without knowing more about the situation, I couldn't say, but it's very, very common. It's a little strange to say that at a time when there were far too many opioids flooding into medical markets, at that same time, there was a crisis of people in pain who needed relief from suffering, who were unable to get it from physicians because of this traditional suspicion of racial minorities among a profession that was still largely white. It's a complicated thing, and it connects to the war on drugs, because in the history of the United States, it's not one of the stories of which the nation can be proud. I think the wars against drugs have traditionally been more wars against certain kinds of people who use drugs. Now, the United States has a very large, well-supported industry to sell potentially addictive drugs. This is the pharmaceutical industry, and most people who use drugs that are potentially addictive have purchased them from the pharmaceutical industry. That's most drug users. And so therefore, you couldn't say that the United States as a society is opposed to drug use, because we have invested a lot of resources and built up a lot of infrastructure to provide drugs to people. But at certain moments in our history, the social authorities and government authorities have used fear of drugs and addiction, and it's frightening. It's a frightening state. People are afraid their children or their family members will be harmed by drugs. They've used that fear to pull together social resources and government powers to police communities that they believe are dangerous. One example is when alcohol was prohibited, the Constitution of the US was amended to make alcohol illegal in the 1920s. And this was primarily done to try to give police and city governments tools to govern and control large groups of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were perceived to be racially and religiously different and perceived to pose a threat to what those authorities understood as traditional American culture. And you see the same thing with more recent episodes of the so-called war on drugs in the 1980s and 1990s, which devastated Black and brown communities in cities, bringing many, many people into the prison system and causing an additional layer of harm to communities that were already suffering from the problems of unregulated drug sales.
Well, I live in Cook County of Chicago area, and if you are found with some drugs, you are for sure to go to prison, certain amount. And if the same amount of drugs are used, a little bit of the West is another county, you're going to be in a rehabilitation program. You're not going to be charged. You're not going to go to prison, and there'll be nothing on your record. I mean, this is just two counties of Greater Chicago area. So racial components of the drug war is there, but there is an international component. If you, I remember reading as a young students, opium wars, when some people were trying to export opium to Chinese government, and the China was resisting, and some wars happened. What was that episode? I have just very vague recollection of reading that.
Well, I will try to summarize it very quickly. in the 1700s and early 1800s, the Chinese economy was very strong, and European nations bought a lot of goods from them, especially spices, tea, and the porcelain called China. But the Chinese society didn't buy anything back from Europe. The Chinese government felt that they already had all of the goods that they needed, and as Britain and Denmark and other nations were building these global empires, they were built on a mercantilist basis. In other words, they wanted to collect riches in their own within their own nation. And so this problem of buying a lot of things from China, sending silver to China to buy things, but China not buying things back, this posed a problem for their understanding of what it meant to succeed as a nation. And so they discovered that one product that Chinese people were buying that was not yet domestically produced in China was smoking opium. Britain had colonial holdings in India where opium was grown, and essentially Britain invested in massively expanding the agriculture in opium and in smuggling that opium to China, because the Chinese government did not want this kind of imports coming in, and it was technically illegal. And in the middle of the 19th century, the Chinese government said, we're going to actually act and stop this smuggling. And they stopped some ships, they burnt some opium supplies that were being delivered. And the British government said, well, this is an attack on free trade, and it can't be done. And so they launched a war to enforce their ability to sell opium, required the government to stop criminalizing it, instead to tax it. And over the next decades, opium became cheaper and more widely available and became a more common form of drug use in China.
So drug war has another manifestation in the history, it seems, and both manifestations seems to be tied to commercial activity, which is not regulated by ethics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think one thing that I try to do as a historian is think about drugs as commodities and consumer goods that travel through commercial circuits like other commodities, and to not be distracted into thinking, well, they are these special things called medicines that aren't like any other good, or they're these special things called narcotics that are entirely illegal and obey their own rules. In fact, throughout human history, these are highly desirable and highly dangerous products with a lot of money to be made from them. And the trick of how you get the good parts of these drugs while minimizing the harms, we haven't quite managed that yet for a lot of reasons. One being this confusion that we started with of of how you define good drug use versus bad drug use. And I define this as a question of health. Is a person being harmed or not? But there's often been a moral evaluation that using drugs is immoral, or a racial evaluation that when white people use drugs, that is a fine thing because they have good qualities and can handle it, but other people, it's dangerous. So these kinds of things don't help us make safe policy. And as a matter of fact, they end up producing situations where consumers are at risk.
Well, Professor, you have been a good teacher to me. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Professor David Herzberg is Associate Professor of History at the University of Buffalo College. Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.